it says that we're streaming live. So
Excellent.
Welcome anyone who's out there, whether you're live now or watching our recording later. Welcome to our very first Meet the Supervisors live stream on Woodbrook's Facebook and YouTube channels. So I guess we'll make a start. 1 minute to, no, it's exactly 4 o'clock on my computer now. So I'm very pleased to be here with Ben Pink Dandelion. Both of us are research supervisors in the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies based at Woodbrook. And I'm just going to ask some questions, but if you'd like to chip in with your questions or reflections, we can see all the comments that come in on Facebook and YouTube while we're live. So please do ask any extra questions and I'll read them out and put them to Ben. So Ben, I thought we could start with thinking about academic research in general. And in particular, I'd like to know what excites you about doing academic research? Why are you in this field?
Thank you, Rhiannon. Well, I mean, it always feels like a great luxury to be able to do research. I think the moments that excite me the most, I think I've done a lot of interviewing as part of my research, and it always feels such a privilege to sit down with somebody, ideally without any end point, and just hear about people's experience. And over the years, people have been so generous at you know, sharing their experiences and beliefs with me, really, and that's always felt like a great privilege. So that way of getting alongside people, I find that very exciting. I think the other exciting bit, though, is trying to make sense of it all, and ideally getting to that point where you have some new way of thinking about the data, thinking about the phenomenon, that hopefully is going to help other people understand a situation in a new way. So maybe it's some turn of phrase, or some within sociology we'd be talking about models, or a theoretical model that might just make a difference. And I get very excited thinking about that, and yes, then trying to articulate it in an accessible way.
Yeah, it sounds really good, particularly the interviewing and stuff. And I guess, was that a big part of your own experience of doing a PhD? And what was that process as a whole like for you?
Okay, thank you, Rhiannon. So I think, like lots of PhD students, I started off thinking I was going to do everything. I'd been doing an undergraduate course at Brighton Polytechnic on a combined humanities degree that involved history, what was called religion and culture, and media. And I met people there who I knew I wanted to work with still, and so I stayed on. They offered me a place to do a PhD. I should say that at that point, the Polytechnic was still part of the local education authority. And as a part-time student who was unemployed, I could do a PhD for £400 a year, which is yeah, was very great, again, privilege and good fortune. I recently got involved with Friends, and I was interested in the diversity of belief within British Quakerism, and I set out a survey, and I had questions on absolutely everything: what newspapers people were reading, how often they did this, whether they read that, what they, you know, I was going to cover everything. And I also then, so I sent the survey out, and we got lots of very interesting data. And then I went to interview people who said they'd be willing to follow that up. And I particularly went both for a diversity of ages and geography, but also I went for people that looked as if they were being contradictory, like saying, no, I don't believe in God, but prayer is a really important part of my life. And I wanted to, you know, was just curious, wanted to find out more. And in the end, I conducted 37 interviews, which lasted at least 2 hours each, and one of them lasted 5 hours. but I mean, just the wealth of what people were prepared to share was fantastic. And I mean, my supervisor did later say, well, maybe you could have done that with 12. I mean, we do tend to do too much, I think, often. But I loved every minute of the interviewing and the traveling around, and, it really was fantastic. So, and then of course you've got a lot of data. So there's always that problem about the wealth of data and what you do with it and how you manage it. And I suppose to some degree, the tedium of either transcribing or with the survey of I needed to code every answer. I had 800 survey forms, and this was the day before Survey Monkey, so I had 800 booklets to go through, and so. But then at the other end, you start churning out on the university mainframe these huge wads of computer paper, and start being able to get statistics or start being able to see patterns in the interviews, and that's really very exciting. And then hopefully move on from there to be able to do some theoretical thinking about it. So interviewing was a big part of that. Later, I also was able to interview ex-Quakers who were not easy to find because they weren't involved with Friends anymore. But that too was a very kind of moving and humbling experience, listening to people about their difficult journeys in and out of the Quaker way.
That's really interesting, and I think I haven't done very much interviewing, but when I have, that resonates with my experience of it. So well, one thing I noticed in what you said there, did you go straight from the undergraduate into a PhD? A lot of people would do a research master's or a research preparation degree now, but that wasn't what you did.
I've done as little as I've needed to, generally. So, I mean, way back, I'd started a hotel management degree, which I then dropped out of and went off to live at an anarchist peace camp. And so this was a second attempt at education, and I did the first degree part-time at Brighton Polytechnic, and then I did indeed just go straight on. They didn't require me to do a master's. I was able to do a kind of upgrade process, and to their credit, they turned me back the first time. They said, we're not going to ask. My supervisor said, we're not going to support this. One of the comments was, you're standing too much like a Quaker. So they wanted me to get a little more distance from the material. I think learn a little better the conventions of academic scholarship. And of course, at the time, I mean, at the time you had one supervisor within the Polytechnic and one outside, and I had Roger Homan at Brighton Polytechnic, who remains a great friend and colleague, and Eileen Barker at the London School of Economics, who's well known for her work on Moonies and other new religious movements. And we had needed to think about who it might be best to have as an external supervisor. And there were other people who were very able, but Roger did think that some of them might have a problem with my name or even with Quakers, and where Eileen, who'd been an actor before, just very open. But I mean, she rang me up the day before having this meeting. She said, I'm going to tell you now that I'm not going to support your upgrade. So you can call me every name under the sun this evening, and then we can sit down and talk about it tomorrow. And, just lots of wisdom and things I've learned hugely from. But of course, as I think is usual in these kinds of processes, that's a very helpful point to be pushed back a little bit and say, well, actually you need to do a little bit more, or you need to understand this process a little bit better. So in the end, I think that was very positive, that I wasn't just kind of I wasn't given the benefit of the doubt, in a sense. And I think now that I supervise, I think it never really helps to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think we do need to hold that point, and as difficult as it may be for us to communicate that to students or for students to hear, generally, I think people have been glad or relieved, even when we've advised them to stop. And so yeah, that was a good good process. But yeah, I went straight on, 4 years, handed it in on the first day I could. That was my goal. It was my driving kind of passion. I think you've got to be a little bit driven to do a PhD. In some way, something's pushing you or pulling you, and you do need something to keep you going during the hard, lonely weeks and months. It's a very isolating experience. Sometimes it's, you know, you become the expert in your niche area. At that time, I didn't know anyone else researching Quakers sociologically. As it happened, 2 other people were, but I didn't meet them. There was no one doing sociology, no one else doing sociology of religion at Brighton. And latterly, I made a network through kind of summer schools that the ESRC put on and things like that. And that was really helpful to find peers. But then I think you also need some kind of light at the end of the tunnel, whether it's sort of changing your title on a checkbook or, you know, but I had this determination that I would hand it in on the first day I could. And secondly, there was a particular restaurant that I wanted to take Roger Homan to. And, you know, I was just lining that up, and it was such a big, I mean, food had been a big part of our supervision relationship. And so just the thought of being able to do that spurred me on, and yeah, and we did indeed have a lovely meal at the end of it, so it was nice. So
So there's something to look forward to at the end of a PhD.
I mean, other people get to the point, you know, of actually of really disliking the PhD and just wanting it to be over, and that also can be a great motivating force. But hopefully, a positive motivation. With, you know, I think it's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were starting the PhD again, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently?
Okay, well, I would have been less ambitious. I mean, it didn't feel like ambition, because I think at the time you think, gosh, this is a PhD, you know, this is really, I'm into the serious stuff now, and it's going to have to be good, and therefore, you know, I'm going to have to say everything about everything. So, and what typically happens through a PhD is that we learn to, you know, it gets focused down. Either we're not going to do 1650 to 2020, or we're not going to do the whole of the world, and we might end up doing, you know, I don't know, you know, a couple of counties for 100 years, or, you know, yeah, it just we need to, you know, so to be realistic, I suppose, about what's possible in 80,000 words. And again, that's difficult to gauge when you're starting, but you will soon find that to go deep into a subject, and deep is better than broad, it will quickly use up words. If you're really discussing the other scholarship, if you're having an argument on the paper with all the evidence for, all the evidence against, and then some kind of synthesis at the end, you know, that's going to take a lot of space. So, but at the beginning, you don't know that. You think, oh gosh, you know, and also you haven't quite, perhaps, become clear on what the focus is. So to some extent, it's only through collecting so much stuff, much more than we ever would need, that we're able to then find something that, you know, works as an argument. And I suppose understanding that the PhD is an argument, and ideally, I mean, you should be able to perhaps say what your PhD is arguing in a sentence. You know, what's your PhD about? You know, should be able to just say it in a sentence. And of course, it is much harder to say things briefly than at length, but that's quite a good exercise. And even halfway through a PhD, I'd be encouraging students to say, well, try drafting an abstract, try drafting that kind of the thing that goes at the front that says, you know, this thesis explores, boom, 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 this thesis argues. And a PhD is not just a descriptive piece of work. It does need to make a contribution to academic knowledge. It does need to have an argument. And so ideally, it will be possible to finish off that second sentence. This thesis argues that. And if it's not quite possible to put it into a sentence or two, then there may be something wrong. We may not quite be at that light bulb moment where we understand, what this piece of work can really contribute. And, again, maybe halfway, 2/3 of the way through the thesis, maybe after all the data's in and there's lots of different threads. Pre-pandemic, I'd like to, typically go to the Woodbrook art room with huge bits of paper, and we'd start doodling the key threads and how they related. And if it didn't flow neatly on the page, we'd get another piece and work it out till it did, till the arrows at least weren't all crisscrossing in a horrible way. And I suppose one of the things to learn is that we will get lots of stuff we won't use in the PhD, but we might use it later. And some of those threads will just fall to one side. So our colleague, John Kirshner, also one of the supervisors in the Center for Research in Quaker Studies, I mean, he was working on John Woolman, and I think appeared with a draft of 150,000 words, which is like, twice really what you need and what's allowed by Birmingham. And again, we sat down and we said, well, you've got so much stuff, it's all fantastic and beautifully written, and we know everything about John Woolman's theology here, but what's the argument you're making? Okay, and we were able to, he was able to, work out what that was, and within 2 weeks had got it down to 80,000 words, because then there was the criteria. Is this pointing towards a conclusion? Does this paragraph add to the argument, or is it an aside or a tangent? And once you can identify the argument, it's quite easy to edit the text down. So things I would say, well, that to bear in mind that it won't do everything we hoped it might. It won't be the final word, but it might be the first word on a whole new field of theorizing. I mean, many of our students are not going on to academic careers. They're often at the end of working lives, and they fancy doing a PhD. But nevertheless, people can keep working. I mean, we might think of our colleague Rosemary Moore, who, began a PhD as a retirement project and has become the preeminent expert in the first decade of Quakerism, and is still publishing 20 years later. I mean, it's been like a second career almost for her. So that it will be the first step and not the last. That we will probably collect more than we need. But I suppose the other thing is really to highlight the importance of good administration. So, you start off with lots of notes, and they're all maybe just, going on, and, you're just putting them there, and then you read another book by the same author, and you realize these notes could get confused because it just says, Grant, page 13, and then you think, well, which Grant? And so, that's something you need to, have a good administrative system for notes, for interview data, for whatever your data sources are. And again, lots of it's mechanical, lots of it's boring. You're continually writing out long biographical information for the bibliography, so bibliographical information. And it feels really dull. Can I just put Grant 2018 and sort it out later? But I mean, I suppose the other thing is everything you do now will be one thing less to do later. And if you do it now, it may be 4 things less to do later. You don't have to go back and get out the 3 Grant 2018s and find which page 13 it is. So, yeah, so good admin, focusing down, and I had a very good relationship with my supervisor. So, I mean, that helped enormously. So I suppose I'd also recommend people find someone that they feel they can work with. It might not be the leading expert. There may be other things at play. But yeah, that's, if you can shop around for a supervisor, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got a question coming on Facebook, which leads on quite nicely from what you were saying about a PhD being the beginning of a process. So what area of Quaker studies do you think is under-researched, or what would be your ideal thing to supervise?
Oh, okay, lovely question. Thank you. Well, there's a lot that's under-researched. So, I mean, what we've seen, I think, since, I mean, you know, we can go back 150 years to look at the beginning of academic Quaker studies. And, you know, Quaker Historical Association in America was set up in the 1870s, Friends Historical Society, 1903. People like, you know, Frederick Tollis and Hugh Barber doing good work in the 50s and 60s. But since the 90s, we've seen a real growth in academic Quaker studies. We've seen, you know, university centers such as ours growing. We've seen the beginning of a refereed journal and a huge growth in academic Quaker publishing. So publishing in Quaker studies by leading academic presses. You know, in some ways we can say, well, you know, a lot has happened in the last 20, 30 years. In other ways, there's huge tracts of the Quaker past that we know very little about. Rosemary Moore, who I just mentioned, has said there should probably be no more theses on the 1650s, unless someone has a very particular angle or new source of data. That's been well trodden. But the second period, 1660s onwards, I mean, and then
that's only one decade she's ruled out of several hundred years.
Sure. And I mean, the 18th century, we have some good regional studies, you know, but we're still lots we don't know. Robin Healy's done some great work, and there's a new book on the 18th century with Penn State Press. And then as we move forward, though, in time, I mean, it becomes quite sparse. So we can think of Elizabeth Isishay's Victorian Quakers, but there's a whole lot of the 19th century that remains under research, particularly in Britain. So the American schisms and separations have been charted, but and then now we're into the 21st century. The 20th century opens itself as an obvious area of research. So again, Thomas Kennedy, fantastic book on British Quakerism, 1860 to 1920, but 1920 plus. Well, you know, I mean, let's have it. So yeah, I think there's lots to do, and you know, and I suppose the other tip here though would be to say follow your passion. So the other way through I mean, and I don't want to make it sound miserable, but I mean, you know, there are tough times when you think, why am I doing this? But hopefully you've got a topic that is, you know, you are passionate about and can keep you motivated for what may be up to 8 years part-time. And again, Roger Homan, who I mentioned, in the end refused to take on students who were funded to do a particular project, because often it was the funding that attracted the student rather than the topic, and we need to keep motivated. So we have a couple of students who in Amish studies within Centre for Research in Quaker Studies, and I think in particular they've shown huge amounts of motivation. You know, they kind of have come into a Quaker study department, if you like, and been the only Amish studies person, or you know, one of two, and have kept going because of that passion. And then after that, David Adshead set up a centre for Quaker studies at the University of Sunderland, and I went to work there. And then as the yearly meeting employment ended, went to work at Woodbrook. And a chance conversation over lunch at Woodbrook, where I was basically just teaching Quaker history to, you know, Quakers, with someone who was moving house from the University of Birmingham meant that suddenly we had a centre at Birmingham as well. So, and Sunderland ended and Birmingham started. And from 1999, most of my work has been around postgraduate supervision. So I did produce a book of the thesis, maybe 3 years after the thesis that came out. There were a couple of journal articles written with my supervisor. But it was only really as that focus of my work changed to being more academically oriented that became my main preoccupation. And so since 1999, I have been involved far more in academic publishing and continued picking up some of that work. So my thesis both tried to chart the diversity of believing within Britain Yearly Meeting as it became. And, you know, one of my conclusions was there was a huge diversity with very little overlap necessarily between people. And that what actually kept the yearly meeting together was a commitment to the way of being a Quaker, to the way of worship, to the way of doing business. What I've called a behavioral creed rather than a belief creed. And I suppose the first thing that happened to that is that I added to that idea by realizing there was also a way of holding beliefs, even whilst they were so different and divergent, that there was this kind of what I called a perhapsness around belief, that nobody was actually claiming that they had the whole truth for everybody for all time. It fits with the kind of self-conception of British Quakers as a seeking church, a church on the move, or a faith group in flux. And so there was what I've labeled an ortho-credence, a particular way of holding beliefs, that they might be personally true or provisionally true or partially true, but not true for all people for all time. And that way of holding beliefs is a very strong glue for the group. It's a kind of identity marker. And it's one of the ways in which I would define a liberal Quaker group, is that it doesn't believe it has the final answers on matters of theology, you know, and have to add in lots of caveats, because we probably do think we have the final word on things like peace and simplicity. And although we're, you know, Quakers are always learning, and I see I'm using we here as a Quaker and as a fulfilled. And I work with Tim Ashworth and Doug Gwynn on the book Heaven on Earth. And that has also led into my work on liturgies of Quakerism and changing patterns of worship and the different theological understandings of what's going on in silence. So all of this interests me. I mean, you know, it's been a very privileged time for me to be able to be paid to research and think about what I'm passionate about. So yeah. And then more recently, so just to finish that bit off, I've taken the Quaker case study more widely, and I've been interested in what I detect as possible signs of kind of internal secularization within Quakerism, you know, where Quakers might be losing explicit kind of an explicit religious framing of the Quaker way, and trying to theorize about that more widely for religious groups as a whole. And I have been partially successful at that. So, you know, my latest book is on that, but again, if I'd had more time, or, you know, I think there's more to do there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have the live stream's been up and down a couple of times.
Okay.
I think we're still live now, but if it goes down again, we might call it a day there. But I wanted to ask you a bit more about maybe the experience of research supervision. So in a typical supervision meeting with a research student, what kinds of things happen? What's that process like on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, thank you. So within the centre, we tend to meet students monthly I will meet people monthly, whether they're part-time or full-time. I think it's useful even just to touch base, even if not much work has happened. I'm very aware of that potential for isolation. Your supervisor becomes your best ally, ideally, and also your sounding board. So I'd want to know at least how the person was, how the work was going. There may be written work to feed back on, or there may be next steps to plan, or of course there may be that moment in the art room with the big bits of paper. But typically a supervision meeting would last up to an hour. If there's a moment, say, with the big bits of paper, might have an hour and a half or even 2 hours. And sometimes the supervision, I had one yesterday, it lasted 17 minutes because actually everything was very clear, the person knew what they were doing, there were no real questions. And students obviously will vary with, in terms of their confidence, in terms of the academic conventions and the process, but also where they are in the process. And if you've got 30 interviews lined up and you're halfway through and you know what you're doing, and you just say, well, keep going, but I mean, is there anything interesting coming up? And remember to keep a log about the process of interviewing, because methodology will be important in a more sociological PhD. So there's always the reminders about the admin, just making sure everything's happening, that things that were agreed the previous time have happened, or at least a log does not happening. And again, at Birmingham University, we have a supervision form which students fill out ahead of meetings, and then that offers a good checklist of things that we've agreed can happen in the next month or before the next meeting. But yeah, so some of it's talking about process, some of it's talking about content, and some of it will be talking about mechanics. And I think also for me anyway, there's a strong pastoral element to supervision. You meet someone regularly for at least 3 to 4 years, maybe 8 years or more. Lots of things happen in people's lives during that time, and you get to know them. And again, that's been a joy and a privilege for me. But also, you want to offer support when it's appropriate. And people go through difficult times. And sometimes it's also about then explaining the options that are available for people. I mean, if they're about to move house and it's going to take 3 months, there's the possibility of having a leave of absence and pausing the degree registration process, rather than keeping paying or trying to struggle to do work even when it's pretty impossible while you're packing boxes and things like that. So so it can be a very very wide-ranging, and it might be about how to do something, it may be how something has been done, but always a pleasure generally. I mean, it's a very pleasurable occupation.
Yes, you get to spend lots of time talking to people who are learning interesting things all the time, and that's always a joy.
Able to teach you, you're learning all the time as well.
Yes.
These new things about Quaker studies or Amish studies or whatever else it happens to be. So
so you mentioned supporting students there, and a leave of absence and things. Are there other ways that students are able to be supported? So we've had these problems during the pandemic, for example, with maybe people not being able to access archives, or their research hasn't been able to go ahead as planned. What does that do to a PhD project, and what are the kinds of things that can be done to support people in those situations?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been very difficult for a number of students. Well, I think for all researchers, but particularly those who've been just about to enter the archives, and then the archives have closed. So, I mean, Woodbrook Library's been closed, Friends House Library has been closed. And so some people have had to try and move things around, write different bits that are possible, or, try and find things digitally or online. And I mean, wonderfully, some of the American Quaker libraries have been very generous with their time in scanning documents and sending them to researchers. But some people have been pausing, and it may be they can read some of the secondary scholarship, but they may already have done that. And so the University of Birmingham has allowed extensions because of the pandemic. It is encouraging students to put a statement in with their theses about how the pandemic has affected their research. So one thesis that was examined recently, the student wasn't able to visit 3 or 4 archives that they'd planned to. They weren't central ones, but they would have added to the thesis. And they were able to explain that to the examiners, that, COVID-19 had basically closed down that option. So, I mean, I think the university's been very supportive of students and of staff. And obviously we in the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies have tried to help people along. Our supervisions have mainly moved online rather than face-to-face. I've found that where I might have telephoned people before and then met them face-to-face, we would use Zoom, so at least we can see each other. And we've been able to set up particular times at Woodbrook for library use, and we've now been able to resume our student days, which happen 3 times a year, in person as well as blended. So people have the choice of coming along and we can see each other, or joining by Zoom. So it's been a time of adaptation, but yes, some considerable frustration for some students, and hopefully we're coming out of the other side of it.
Yeah, thank you. So if you were talking to someone, maybe there's someone watching this video who's in 2 minds about whether to start a research degree or whether to apply, what kinds of things would you say to them? What should they be thinking about in making that decision?
Okay, thanks. I suppose I'd ask them why they wanted to do a PhD in particular. I mean, people might have a live topic, but they could perhaps try writing a book. So is there something about doing the PhD that is either particularly appealing or appropriate? And I mean, a PhD is great value, in my opinion, because you get all the university of all the resources of the university, plus this kind of regular supervision and support. So, for some people, that is the best way to do the research they want to do, regardless of any kind of future ambition. You've got the whole university library, got all the digital resources that are not available to most people who are independent researchers. So, but I mean, sometimes people come along and they might say, well, I've been looking at this and Quakers have got this all wrong, and I want to do a PhD to show that And I'd say, well, first of all, it's probably better to say you're going to explore a phenomenon rather than you know exactly what you want to argue. But also, are you sure this is a PhD project? And it may be a Quaker concern, or it may be something you want to do less formally or more passionately than academic convention allows. Personal value judgment is not part of a PhD. So to say, these Quakers are all wrong and, is not going to get you anywhere with the examiners or the university. And some of my job has been often looking at writing and pulling that stuff out and saying, hold on a minute, you can't quite say that, or afterwards you can say it, but not for the PhD examination process. So is it a PhD? Are you prepared to spend 3 to 6 years on this? How is it time-wise with other commitments? So if anyone's working full-time, I would be very cautious about accepting them onto a PhD program, though people have done that successfully. And budget, there's the fees, but there's also research expenses. You might be traveling around to interview or traveling to archives. The people studying the Amish needed to travel to America regularly. And the university may help with some of that, but it's not guaranteed. Or there may be trusts that can help, but unless you've already discussed it with them, you need to be sure you can see this through financially as well as in terms of time. And I suppose I'd also ask about what other support systems there are, or if someone's in a family situation, are the family keen or supportive, and do they understand what it might involve? Because I think it does involve becoming fairly antisocial at times. And I think it's quite difficult for someone who hasn't done a PhD or isn't involved in academic life to know why someone is spending so long reading so much, or even just thinking, or apparently doing next to nothing, jumping through all these hoops of academic conventions to come up with something that looks about the length of a paperback. You could write that in a few weeks, surely. And yeah, I mean, I remember a comment when I got my PhD, just, well, thank God that's over. I mean, it just hadn't been a very social experience. So, yeah, somebody said that to me. So I'd want to check all those things out with them. Obviously, we have to check whether someone has what their academic record is and whether they've done anything relevant before. We have had a student who came to us with A-levels and ended up with a PhD. Along the way, though, they had worked at a particular level professionally, and we were able to use that as kind of evidence of an equivalence to a degree work. But that's becoming increasingly difficult, I think, to persuade university admissions to accept. They may well ask someone to go away and do a certificate or a diploma. If you've spent all your life studying music and now you want to come and do Quaker theology, then they may say, well, can you do a taught course first and then apply for a research degree? Though often the taught courses also have quite high admission requirements. So it can be a little bit tricky. There is this upgrade process from master's to PhD, and we've used that successfully sometimes. So, but yeah, we have to check that out. And yeah, and also, I mean, then what is the topic? And, people do need to come with an idea or an area. And a very important part of the application process is writing a proposal that will lay out what it is the person wants to study and why that's academically interesting and how it fits with what's been done before. So they do need to do a bit of reading around and, checking in some online library catalogs to find, well, who else has written in this area? What is it building on? Is it actually something new? Or is it just something that's been done before and is hidden? So I would, and I know you would work with the student to try and perfect that proposal. So someone may come with a very rough draft or even an idea. We work with them on the proposal until it's at the point where we say, yes, this is the kind of thing the university is looking for. Please now apply. And then it will eventually come back to us and we can accept the student. So, but yeah, I mean, at one point, people would make an inquiry, and then if I didn't hear from them, I would email them later and say, have you thought any more? A bit like a car salesperson. And I've actually stopped doing that because I think the student has to be really highly motivated. And of course, there's always the lure of, that somehow the PhD offers you status or some kind of place in the world, and that's not going to be enough to see someone through. So a passion for a clear area of work with some good ideas about what it's going to involve and how it can be done, that's viable, feasible, and we will have those conversations and help people see those things. But yeah, that's the kind of initial conversation I'd have with somebody.
Yes, and that can be the start of the very collaborative supervision relationship. Even before the research actually starts, that proposal can be the beginning of that, working together on it. So we're coming towards the end of this. I've just got one last question for you, which is, you've spoken about passion and being interested in this.
Gosh. I could be very facetious, and I mean, my supervision meetings were composed partly of trying out different versions of chocolate marzipan, and I do know that certain brands are far superior to others. I think, I mean, the thing that's grabbing me now is internal secularization and the way in which we talk about our faith. Seems to me to be really important. The way Quakers talk about their faith seems to be really important. From a linguistics background, but it really is very interesting. And I think the other thing that remains really interesting is this idea of a second coming church and what Quakers do with that foundation. I mean, there's a debate about whether that's even an accurate characterization of the first period. At the moment, the scholarly consensus is that it is. But that ongoing kind of relationship with that foundation interests me, and it applies to all Christian groups. What do they do with the second coming? And that interests me, and will continue to, I'm sure. So.
I'm sure, and perhaps there are some other people out there who are interested too. And if they are, they're very welcome to get in touch with us and talk about research degrees.
Yeah.
We'll finish there. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much to everyone who has been or is watching this online, and we'll be back in a couple of months. We'll be switching over, and Ben will be interviewing me for the next one of our Meet the Supervisors sessions. But yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and we'll finish there for today.
Thank you. That's July the 21st. I'll be talking to you. So I look forward to it.
I'll see everyone in July. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Bye-bye.
Bye.